Some stories don't begin with grand entrances or fanfare. They begin with a quiet moment, a cup of coffee growing cold, a screen door creaking in the wind, and a decision made before the mind fully catches up. This is a story about what happens when life shows up uninvited, when something broken finds its way to your doorstep and asks, without words, if you still have enough left in you to care. It's about a woman who thought her useful days were behind her, about a son who forgot the way home, and about a dog who had every reason to stop trusting people but chose to try one more time. If you've ever felt invisible, or wondered if your best years have already passed, this story is for you, because sometimes the thing that saves us is the thing we never expected to need. The coffee had gone cold in her hands. Margaret Thompson stood on the porch of the farmhouse she'd lived in for 47 years, watching the mist roll across the Montana pasture like smoke from a fire no one had lit. 5 in the morning. The hour Harold used to wake to feed the cattle. The cattle were gone now, sold off 18 months ago. But her body still remembered the routine, still pulled her from bed before dawn, still carried her to the same spot on the porch where she could see the old oak tree Harold had planted the year they married. She raised the mug to her lips, then stopped. Something was wrong. There was a shape beneath the oak, a dark mass, large and motionless, pressed against the trunk where Harold's ashes had been scattered 3 years before. Margaret squinted. A deer? Maybe. Hit by a car on the highway and wandered here to die. It happens sometimes. Or a bag of garbage someone had dumped at the edge of her property, kids from town. Probably, thinking an old widow wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. She set the mug on the porch railing, took one step down, then another. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through her worn slippers. The chill of early morning cut through her thin robe, settled into her joints. She ignored it. 68 years of Montana winters had taught her to ignore a lot of things. 20 feet from the oak. She stopped. The shape moved. A head lifted from the ground, slow, heavy, like it cost everything just to raise it. 2 eyes caught the pale morning light. Amber. Deep. Looking straight at her, not a deer, not garbage, a dog. Margaret felt her breath catch. The animal was enormous, a German shepherd, or what was left of one. Its coat was matted with dirt and something darker. Dried blood. Maybe. Its ribs showed through the fur like the slats of a broken fence. And its belly. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. The dog's belly was swollen. Distended. Moving. Not sick. Not bloated. Pregnant. The dog didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth, didn't try to stand or run. It just lay there, breathing in shallow. Labored gasps, watching Margaret with eyes that held no fear. No aggression, only exhaustion. Only the kind of weariness that comes from running out of places to go. Margaret had seen that look before. In the emergency room. On the faces of patients who knew they were dying but still reached for the nurse's hand when the gurney rolled past. They never said anything. They just reached. This dog wasn't reaching. It couldn't. But those eyes were asking the same question. Will you help me, or will you walk away? Margaret stood frozen. The mist curled around her ankles. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. She thought of Harold, of the last words he'd spoken to her in the hospital, his hand cold in hers, his voice barely a whisper. Maggie, don't let this house go quiet. Promise me. She had promised, and she had failed. For 3 years, she had let the silence swallow her whole, let the house become a museum, let herself become a ghost haunting her own life. The dog's head dropped back to the ground. A soft whimper escaped its throat. Margaret looked at the oak tree, at the small granite stone marking where Harold's ashes lay, at the morning light beginning to touch the leaves. Then she looked back at the dog. "Well," she said aloud, her voice rusty from disuse, "I'll be—" She walked forward, knelt down. Her knees cracked against the cold ground. The dog flinched just barely, a muscle twitch beneath the matted fur. But it didn't snap, didn't bite. Margaret reached out, her fingers touched the top of the dog's head, felt the warmth beneath the dirt, felt the faint tremor of a body pushed past its limits. The dog closed its eyes, and then, so gently Margaret almost missed it, it licked her hand. Just once, a single, slow stroke of its tongue across her palm. Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at the dog's belly again, saw it ripple, saw something inside shift and press against the skin. "How far did you come?" she whispered. "How long have you been looking for a place to stop?" The dog didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But those amber eyes opened again, found hers, and held them. Margaret noticed now what she'd missed before the porch light had been on all night. She'd forgotten to turn it off again, and the kitchen window faced this direction. Warm, yellow glow spilling into the darkness. Maybe that was why. Maybe this dog, starving and desperate, had seen the light from the road, had smelled the bacon grease Margaret had poured out yesterday morning, had dragged herself across the field toward the only sign of life for miles. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something Margaret couldn't explain and didn't need to. She thought of all the years she'd spent as a nurse, all the lives she'd held in her hands, all the time she'd been the last kind face someone saw before the end. She thought she was done with all that, thought her hands had nothing left to give. She was wrong. "All right," she said, her voice steadier now. "You came to my door, not anyone else's. Reckon that makes you my responsibility." She stood. Her back protested. Her hip ached. She ignored both. She walked back to the house, grabbed the old wool blanket from the porch swing, the one Harold used to wrap around her shoulders on cold nights, and carried it back to the oak tree. She draped it over the dog, tucked it around the swollen belly. The dog's tail moved, just a twitch, just the faintest wag. Margaret looked toward the house. Toward the phone mounted on the kitchen wall, the old rotary that Harold had refused to replace, with the long cord he'd installed so she could talk while she cooked. She hadn't called her son in 3 weeks. Not a real call. Just the obligatory Sunday check-ins that lasted 8 minutes and said nothing. But this was different. This was something she couldn't do alone. Margaret walked into the house, lifted the receiver, and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang 5 times before a groggy voice answered. "Mom, it's not even 6. What's wrong?" Margaret looked out the kitchen window toward the oak tree, toward the dark shape beneath the blanket. "There's a dog here, James. She's pregnant. She's hurt bad." Margaret paused. "I need you." Silence on the other end, long enough that Margaret thought the line might have gone dead. Then her son's voice, different now, awake, alert. "Did you call the shelter?" Margaret watched the dog's flank rise and fall beneath the blanket. Rise and fall, rise and fall. "She came to my door," Margaret said. "Not theirs." Another pause, then, "I'm on my way." The line went dead. Margaret hung up the phone, stood there for a moment, hand still on the receiver. For the first time in 3 years, she had said, "I need you," to her son. And for the first time in 3 years. He hadn't asked why. She grabbed her coat, Harold's old Carhartt jacket, still hanging by the door, still smelling faintly of tobacco and engine oil, and walked back out to the oak tree. The dog was still there, still breathing, still waiting. Margaret sat down on the cold ground beside her, put a hand on the dog's side, felt the life moving beneath her palm. "Help's coming," she said softly. "Just hold on a little longer." The dog's eyes opened, found hers, and stayed. If this story reached you today, I'd love to know where you're reading from. Sometimes the smallest connections remind us we're not as alone as we feel, and that's what porchside stories have always been about. The farmhouse had stood on this land since 1962. Harold Thompson built it with his own hands, a 2-story frame structure with cedar siding and a wraparound porch that faced east, toward the mountains. He'd poured the foundation the week after their wedding, told Margaret he wanted her to watch the sunrise every morning for the rest of her life. She still did, even now. Margaret pulled Harold's Carhartt art jacket tighter around her shoulders and watched the dog breathe. The wool blanket rose and fell. Rose and fell. Each exhale carried a faint wheeze that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. The farm had changed since Harold passed. The cattle pen stood empty, weeds pushing through the fence rails. The barn doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. The tractor sat in the equipment shed under a layer of dust so thick Margaret could write her name in it. She hadn't written her name. She hadn't touched any of it. Inside the house, Harold's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. His boots still waited by the back door. His coffee mug, the chipped blue one with the faded elk on the side, still occupied its spot on the kitchen shelf. 3 years. She'd moved nothing, changed nothing. The grandfather clock in the living room still ticked. Some nights, lying in bed, Margaret could hear it through the walls. Tick, 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 counting the seconds of a life she no longer recognized as her own. The dog shifted beneath the blanket. A soft whine escaped her throat. Margaret leaned closer, pressed her palm against the swollen belly. Movement. Something pushing back against her hand from the inside. "Easy," Margaret whispered. "Easy now." The dog's ear twitched, torn at the edge. Margaret noticed now, a ragged chunk missing. The wound long healed into scar tissue, and there along the ridge of her spine a line of raised flesh beneath the matted fur. Thin, precise, not an accident, not a tangle with barbed wire. Someone had done this to her. Margaret's jaw tightened. 35 years in emergency rooms had taught her to read wounds, burns from cigarettes, cuts from belts. The geography of cruelty mapped on skin. This dog had known hands that hurt instead of helped, had learned that humans meant pain. And still she had come here. Still, she had stayed. The sound of an engine broke the morning silence. Margaret looked up, headlights cutting through the mist on the county road. A truck, Harold's old pickup, the one James had taken when he moved to Bozeman. Coming fast. The dog heard it too. Her head lifted, her body tensed beneath the blanket. Margaret put a hand on her neck. "It's all right. That's my boy." The truck turned onto the gravel drive. Stones crunched under tires. James was here. But as Margaret watched the pickup approach, she noticed something else. The dog's breathing had changed. Faster now, shallower, and beneath her palm, the belly had gone rigid, hard as stone. Margaret's stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. The truck door slammed, boots on gravel, fast. James Thompson crossed the yard in long strides, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. 42 years old. Tall like his father. Same square jaw, same calloused hands. But the eyes, those were Margaret's. Dark brown, always watching, always measuring. He stopped 3 feet from the oak tree, looked at the dog, looked at his mother kneeling in the wet grass in her bathrobe and slippers, wearing his dead father's jacket. How long has she been like this, Found her maybe 40 minutes ago." Margaret kept her hand on the dog's belly. She was breathing easier before. Now she's... "I can see." James dropped to his knees beside her. The canvas bag hit the ground, medical instruments clinking inside. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the dog's gums, pressing fingers to her throat, pulling back eyelids to examine the whites of her eyes. The dog flinched at his touch. A low rumble started in her chest. "Easy, girl." James's voice dropped, steady, calm, the voice he used with frightened animals. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The rumbling stopped. The dog's eyes found Margaret's face and stayed there. James ran his hands along her flank, pressed gently against the swollen belly. His fingers stopped, pressed again. Margaret watched his face, watched the slight tightening around his mouth. "How bad?" James didn't answer right away. He reached into his bag, pulled out a stethoscope, pressed it to the dog's abdomen, listened, moved it. Listened again. "There's at least 8 in there, maybe 10. He pulled the stethoscope away. "Heartbeats are weak. Some of them might already be gone." Margaret's hand tightened on the dog's fur. "Her leg's infected." James continued. He lifted the blanket, exposing the hind leg. The wound Margaret had seen earlier, what she'd thought was a healing cut, was worse than she'd realized. Swollen, seeping. The skin around it mottled red and purple. Been festering for days, maybe longer. If we don't get those pups out, the dead ones will go septic. Toxins will spread. She'll be gone by nightfall. The dog whimpered. Her body trembled beneath Margaret's palm. "What do you need?" James looked at her, really looked, for the first time since he'd arrived. His professional mask slipped. Underneath was something raw, something that looked almost like fear. "She needs a surgical suite, anesthesia, monitoring equipment, things I don't have." "Then what do you have?" James glanced back at his bag, at the farmhouse behind them, at the kitchen window where the morning light was just starting to brighten. "Enough to try, maybe." Margaret stood. Her knees ached. Her back protested. She ignored both. "Your father built this house with a handsaw and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. I delivered babies in the back of ambulances during blizzards." She looked down at the dog, at those amber eyes still watching her. "We don't need perfect, James. We need good enough." James stared at her. Something shifted in his expression. "All right." He stood, grabbed his bag. "We need to get her inside. Kitchen table, clear it off. Cover it with clean sheets, boil water, find every clean towel in the house." Margaret was already moving toward the porch. "And Mom?" She stopped, turned. James crouched beside the dog again. His hand rested on her head. Gentle, despite the urgency in his voice. "That medical kit you kept, the one from your nursing days, you still have it." Margaret nodded. "Under the bed, where she'd put it 5 years ago and never touched again." "Get it." She climbed the porch steps, pushed through the screen door. The kitchen was dim, the morning light still thin through the windows. She moved without thinking, pulling sheets from the linen closet, filling the biggest pot with water, setting it on the stove. The medical kit was exactly where she remembered. Dusty, the latches stiff. She carried it to the kitchen table and opened it. Scissors, forceps, sutures, gauze, betadine, all of it still there, all of it waiting. She hadn't touched these instruments since the day she retired, hadn't wanted to. Thought that part of her life was finished. Through the window. She watched James lift the dog in his arms. The animal hung limp, too weak to struggle. But her head turned. Her eyes found the house. Found Margaret. The screen door banged open. "Table, ready." Margaret pulled the last corner of the sheet taut. "Ready!" James laid the dog down. Her body barely covered half the surface. The belly rose like a hill between them, taut and still. James opened his bag, pulled out a scalpel. His hands were steady, but when he looked at Margaret, she saw what he wasn't saying. Some of those pups were already dead inside her, and if they didn't move fast, the mother would follow. James pulled on latex gloves. The snap echoed in the quiet kitchen. "I need you to hold her head," he said. "Keep her calm, talk to her if you have to." Margaret moved to the end of the table. She placed both hands on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into the matted fur. The animal's pulse fluttered beneath her palms too fast, too weak. "What about anesthesia? Local, only. I don't have enough for general, and her heart's too weak anyway. She goes under all the way. She might not come back up." James arranged his instruments on a clean towel beside the dog's flank. Scalpel, hemostats, suture kit, syringes. "I'm going to numb the area. She'll feel pressure, but not pain. Hopefully." He drew liquid into a syringe from a small vial. His movements were precise, economical, no wasted motion. Margaret watched him work, watched the way his jaw set, the way his shoulders squared, just like Harold used to look when he was fixing something that mattered. James injected the anesthetic in a careful line along the dog's belly. The animal flinched, whimpered, but she didn't snap. "Good girl," Margaret murmured. "Good girl. Stay with me." The dog's eyes rolled toward her voice, found her face, held on. James waited, tested the skin with the tip of a probe. The dog didn't react. "All right." He picked up the scalpel. "Here we go." Then he stopped. His hand hovered over the dog's belly. The blade caught the light from the kitchen window. "Why didn't you call someone else? Mom?" Margaret looked up. James wasn't watching the dog anymore. He was watching her. "There's a shelter in Bozeman. There's 3 other vets between here and there. Any of them could have handled this." Margaret's hand stayed on the dog's neck. She could feel the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the life hanging by a thread. "Your daddy asked me one thing before he passed." James's jaw tightened. He didn't look away. "He said, 'Don't let this house go quiet.'" Margaret's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Been pretty quiet around here, James, for 3 years now." The kitchen fell silent. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. Only the dog's labored breath. James looked down at his hands, at the scalpel, at the gloves already spotted with antiseptic. "I should have come home more. Yeah, you should have." No softening. No comfort. Just the truth, sitting between them like a third person at the table. James nodded once. Something passed across his face, not quite pain, not quite acceptance. Something in between. "All right, then." He lowered the scalpel to the dog's belly. "Let's get to work." The blade touched skin. Margaret held her breath. James made the first incision a clean, straight line along the lower abdomen. The dog tensed beneath Margaret's hands but didn't cry out. Her legs twitched. Her breathing quickened. "Easy," Margaret said. "Easy now. Almost there." Blood welled along the cut. James dabbed it away with gauze, working fast. His fingers disappeared into the opening, feeling, searching. "I've got one." He pulled his hand back. Cradled in his palm was a small, wet form. Dark fur slicked against a tiny body. Not moving. He handed it to Margaret. She took it without thinking, muscle memory from decades of emergency rooms. She grabbed a clean towel, rubbed the puppy's chest, cleared its mouth with her finger. Nothing. She rubbed harder, pressed her lips to its muzzle, gave a tiny puff of air. Still nothing. "Mom." James's voice was gentle. "That one's gone. Probably been gone for a while." Margaret looked down at the small body in her hands. No bigger than her fist. Perfect ears. Perfect paws. Eyes that would never open. She wrapped it in the towel, set it aside. "Next one," she said. James reached in again. Another puppy emerged. This one squirmed. A tiny squeak escaped its mouth. Margaret took it. Rubbed it clean. The puppy wriggled against her palms, mewling. "That's one," James said. He was already reaching for the next. They fell into a rhythm. James extracting, Margaret receiving. Some puppies came out crying, alive and fighting. Others came out silent. Still, 3, 4, 5 alive. 6 was still. 7 cried loud enough to fill the kitchen. 8 alive. 9 still. James paused. His arms were red to the elbows. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the table. "One more. I can feel it." He reached deeper, his face twisted with concentration. "It's stuck. Positioned wrong." He adjusted his grip. "Come on, come on!" The dog whimpered. Her whole body shuddered. "Hold her," James said. "She's trying to push." Margaret pressed down on the dog's shoulders. The animal's legs kicked against the table. James pulled. A small, dark form slid free. Smaller than the others. Much smaller. He handed it to Margaret. The puppy fit in one palm. Its fur was thin. Its limbs fragile as bird bones. It wasn't breathing. Margaret stared at the tiny body, felt nothing move beneath her fingers. James was already turning back to the mother, reaching for sutures, working to close the incision before infection could set in. "That one's the runt," he said without looking. "Probably didn't get enough nutrients. It happens sometimes. They just don't." The puppy twitched. Margaret froze. Had she imagined it? The puppy twitched again. A shudder ran through its tiny body. Margaret cupped both hands around it. The fur was slick. Cold. She could feel the ribs beneath the skin. Each one distinct as piano keys. "James!" He didn't turn. His hands worked the suture needle through the mother's skin, closing the incision with quick, practiced stitches. "James!" Something in her voice made him stop. He looked over his shoulder. Margaret held up the puppy. It lay motionless in her palms. Then, its chest hitched, a tiny convulsive movement. "It's trying," she said. James set down the needle, crossed to her side. He pressed 2 fingers against the puppy's chest, counted. His lips moved silently. Heart's beating, barely. He grabbed a clean towel, took the puppy from her hands. "Come on, little one." He rubbed the towel across the tiny body, firm strokes, up and down the spine. The puppy's head lolled. Its legs hung limp. Airway might be blocked. James tilted the puppy downward, head lower than body, tapped its back with 2 fingers. A bubble of fluid escaped the puppy's mouth, then another. James rubbed again, faster now. Margaret stood beside him, hands clenched at her sides. The other puppies squirmed in the cardboard box she'd lined with towels. 7 of them, crying and crawling over each other, searching for warmth. 2 more lay wrapped in a dish towel on the counter. Still, silent. The runt made no sound. James kept rubbing, his jaw tight, his breath coming hard. "Sometimes they just don't." The puppy coughed, a wet, choking sound. Its body spasmed, then it drew a breath, a real breath, lungs expanding, chest rising, and it cried. The sound was thin, reedy, more like a kitten than a dog, but it was there. Margaret's knees went weak. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. James cradled the puppy against his chest. His shoulders dropped. He let out a breath he'd been holding for what seemed like hours. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be." He handed the puppy to Margaret. She took it, held it close, felt the tiny heart fluttering against her palm like a trapped bird. The puppy nuzzled into her warmth, its cries softened to whimpers, then to silence. But the good kind of silence, the kind that meant sleep, not death. "She's not out of the woods," James said. He returned to the mother, picked up his needle, resumed stitching. Runt of the litter, underdeveloped. She might not make it through the night. Margaret looked down at the small form in her hands. The puppy fit entirely in one palm. Its ears were folded flat against its head. Its eyes sealed shut. Its paws no bigger than Margaret's thumbnail. "She'll make it," Margaret said. James glanced at her. Didn't argue. The mother dog lay still on the table, breathing slow and even. The anesthetic was wearing off. Her eyelids fluttered. "She's waking up," James said. "Help me move her." They lifted the dog together, James taking the front, Margaret the back. She was heavier than she looked, dense with muscle beneath the malnourished frame. They carried her to the living room, laid her on the old, braided rug in front of the fireplace. The cardboard box of puppies went beside her. 7 healthy pups, 1 runt still fighting, 2 that never had a chance. Margaret knelt beside the mother, stroked her head. The dog's eyes opened. Amber, clouded with pain and exhaustion. She lifted her head, looked at the box of squirming puppies. Then she looked at the small bundle in Margaret's hands. A whine escaped her throat. Low, urgent. Margaret understood. She placed the runt beside the mother's belly, nestled among the other puppies. The 7 stronger pups pushed forward immediately, latching on, sucking. The runt lay where Margaret had placed her, too weak to compete, too small to fight for space. One of the larger pups kicked her aside. She rolled onto her back, legs paddling uselessly at the air. Margaret reached down, picked her up again. "She can't nurse," James said. He was cleaning his instruments at the kitchen sink, water running red down the drain. "She's too weak. The others will push her out every time." "Then I'll bottle feed her." James turned off the water, dried his hands on a dish towel. He looked at his mother still in her bathrobe, still wearing his father's jacket over it, kneeling on the floor with a dying puppy in her hands. "Mom, that's every 2 hours, around the clock. You can't what?" Margaret didn't look up. She was stroking the runt's belly with one finger. Tiny, circular motions. "I raised you on 3 hours of sleep for 2 years. Colic, remember. You screamed every night till you were 2. James opened his mouth, closed it. "I remember how to do this," Margaret said. "I remember how to keep something alive." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed. 7 o'clock. Morning light filled the kitchen now, warm and golden, catching the dust motes floating in the air. James pulled a chair from the kitchen table, sat down heavily. He looked exhausted, blood on his shirt, sweat drying on his forehead, dark circles under his eyes. "I'll stay tonight," he said. "Help you get set up." Margaret nodded. She carried the runt to Harold's old rocking chair by the window. Sat down. The chair creaked beneath her weight, a familiar sound. One she'd heard 1,000 times when Harold sat here reading his westerns. She settled the puppy against her chest, felt its tiny heart beating, felt her own heart beating back. The mother dog lifted her head from the rug, watched Margaret with those amber eyes, then she lowered her head again, let her own eyes close. Something passed between them, Margaret couldn't name it. Didn't try. She just sat there, rocking slowly, holding the smallest life she'd ever held, and watched the sun climb higher over the Montana mountains. The first night was the longest. Margaret sat in Harold's rocking chair while the house grew dark around her. James had gone to the spare bedroom to sleep, she'd insisted. Told him he'd be useless tomorrow if he didn't rest. He'd argued. She'd won. Some things never changed. Every 2 hours, she fed the runt. Puppy formula mixed with warm water, administered through an eyedropper because the puppy was too weak to suck from a bottle. Drop by drop. Watching the tiny throat work, counting each swallow, the mother dog slept by the fireplace, her surviving puppies piled against her belly. Occasionally she'd lift her head, look at Margaret, then settle back down. At midnight, the runt stopped eating. Margaret tried again, squeezed a drop of formula onto the puppy's lips. It dribbled down, soaking into the towel. She tried again, same result. The puppy lay limp in her palm. Breathing, but barely. The tiny body had gone cold despite being pressed against Margaret's chest. She wrapped the puppy in another towel, held her closer, skin to skin, the way she'd learned in the NICU during her nursing years. Body heat, the most basic medicine there was. She rocked, waited, prayed not out loud, just in her head, the way she'd prayed during all those long nights in the emergency room when medicine wasn't enough. At 2 a.m, the puppy stirred, opened its mouth, made a small mewling sound. Margaret had the eyedropper ready. Drop, swallow, drop, swallow. The puppy drank half an ounce, then fell asleep again. Margaret kept rocking. At 3, James came downstairs. He found her still in the chair, still holding the puppy, still awake. He didn't say anything, just pulled a kitchen chair into the living room, sat down beside her, and stayed there until dawn. 3 days passed. The mother grew stronger. She ate the food Margaret put in front of her cautiously at first, refusing to touch it while Margaret watched. Margaret learned to set the bowl down and walk away. Only then would the dog approach. She learned other things too. The dog flinched when Margaret reached for her too quickly. She cowered at sudden movements, at raised voices, at anything that cast a shadow across her vision, and she wouldn't go near anything that looked like a stick. When James left a broom leaning against the porch rail, the dog pressed herself into the corner of the living room and wouldn't come out for an hour. Margaret moved the broom. Didn't mention it to James. Some things didn't need explaining. The 7 healthy puppies thrived. They nursed. They slept. They grew visibly larger each day, their bellies round and tight. The runt fought. Every feeding was a battle. She was too weak to nurse from her mother, too small to compete with her siblings. Margaret fed her by hand, every 2 hours, day and night. Sometimes the puppy ate. Sometimes she refused. Sometimes she lay so still that Margaret held a finger under her nose to check if she was breathing. On the 3rd night, James sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. The puppy was asleep in a towel-lined shoebox between them, a heating pad set to low beneath it. "You should name her," James said. Margaret looked at the mother dog lying on the rug with her puppies. "Name who? The mom, the pups." James shrugged. "They're yours now, whether you planned on it or not." Margaret considered this. She hadn't thought about names, hadn't thought past the next feeding, the next hour, the next breath. "Hope?" she said. James waited. "The mother. Her name is Hope." He nodded slowly. "Why Hope?" Margaret stroked the runt's head with one finger. The puppy shifted in her sleep. Her tiny mouth worked, sucking at nothing. "Because she showed up at my door half dead and still believed someone might help her." Margaret's voice was quiet. That takes something. I don't know what to call it except hope. James was silent for a moment. Then, and the little one, Margaret looked at the runt, so small, so fragile, fighting for every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of existence. Grace. James raised an eyebrow. Why Grace? Margaret didn't answer right away. She thought about all the patients she'd watched die over 35 years. All the ones who should have made it and didn't. All the ones who shouldn't have made it and did. Some things don't have explanations, she finally said. Some things just are. James nodded. He didn't ask anything else. 2 weeks. Hope learned to trust. It happened slowly, incrementally. A process measured not in hours but in moments. The first time she ate while Margaret stood in the room instead of leaving. The first time she let Margaret touch her without flinching. The first time she followed Margaret from room to room. Not out of fear, but out of something else. Something that looked almost like want. On the 12th night. Margaret sat on the sofa reading Harold's book, the one he'd been reading when he died. A dog-eared western with a gas station receipt marking page 203. She'd never moved it, never finished it for him. Just left it on the nightstand like everything else. She'd brought it downstairs that morning. She didn't know why. Hope lay on the rug with her puppies. Grace was in Margaret's lap, wrapped in a dish towel, sleeping after her 8 o'clock feeding. The fire had burned down to embers. The house was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the soft sounds of puppies nursing. Hope stood. Margaret looked up from the book. The dog crossed the room. Slowly, deliberately, her injured leg was healing, but she still favored it, still moved with a slight limp. She stopped in front of the sofa, looked at Margaret with those amber eyes. Then she stepped forward and laid her head on Margaret's knee. Margaret froze. Her hand hovered in the air, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever this was. Hope didn't move, didn't pull away, just rested her head there, warm and heavy, her eyes drifting closed. Margaret lowered her hand, touched the dog's head, felt the rough fur, the warmth beneath it, the steady rhythm of breathing. The book slid from her other hand and hit the floor. She didn't pick it up. She just sat there, one hand on Hope, one hand on Grace, and let the silence fill her. Not the empty silence she'd lived with for 3 years. A different kind. The kind that meant she wasn't alone. James left on day 15, back to his practice in Bozeman, back to his life. But he promised to return on the weekend, and for the first time in 3 years, Margaret believed him. She stood on the porch and watched his truck disappear down the county road. Hope sat beside her, leaning against her leg. Grace was inside, asleep in her shoebox, growing stronger every day. The sun was setting over the mountains, purple and gold and pink. The kind of sunset Harold used to call showing off. Margaret put her hand on Hope's head. "Well, girl," she said, "looks like it's just us now." Hope's tail wagged. Once, twice. Margaret turned to go inside. Then she stopped. Hope had gone rigid beside her, ears flat, body tense. The dog was staring at the end of the driveway. Where the gravel met the county road, a car was parked there. A white sedan Margaret didn't recognize. And someone was walking toward the house. The figure came closer, a woman, middle-aged, wearing a county jacket and carrying a clipboard. Hope pressed against Margaret's leg, a low growl building in her throat. "Easy, girl." Margaret kept her hand on Hope's head, kept her eyes on the approaching stranger. The woman stopped at the edge of the porch. She had a pleasant face, professional smile, the kind of smile that came with bad news wrapped in bureaucratic language. Mrs. Thompson. Just Margaret. I'm Karen Wells, Jefferson County Animal Control. She gestured toward the white sedan. We received a call about unlicensed animals on this property. Margaret's hand tightened on Hope's fur. A call from who? Karen's smile didn't waver. I'm not at liberty to say, but I do need to conduct an inspection. County regulations. Hope growled again. Margaret hushed her. Now's not a good time. I understand, ma'am, but the report mentioned multiple dogs, possibly a breeding operation without proper permits. Karen consulted her clipboard. I'm required to verify the animal's welfare and documentation. Margaret thought of the 7 puppies inside, of Grace in her shoebox, of Hope, still healing, still learning to trust. Come back tomorrow, she said. I'll have my son here. He's a veterinarian. Karen hesitated, then nodded. Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. Please have all documentation ready. She turned and walked back to her car. The engine started. The sedan reversed down the driveway and disappeared onto the county road. Margaret stood on the porch until the sound faded. Her hands were shaking. She knew who had made that call. There was only one person close enough to see her comings and goings, one person who had watched from across the fields these past 3 years without once coming to visit. Martha Hendricks, bridge partner, church friend, neighbor since 1985. Margaret went inside, closed the door, leaned against it. Hope pressed her nose against Margaret's hand. It's all right, girl, Margaret said, but her voice was thin, unconvincing. She would deal with it tomorrow, right now. She had a puppy to feed. The 19th morning started wrong. Margaret woke in Harold's rocking chair, Grace's shoebox on her lap. She'd fallen asleep during the 4 o'clock feeding. The first time she'd slept more than 2 hours straight in 3 weeks. Sunlight slanted through the window, too bright, too late. She'd missed the 6 o'clock feeding. Margaret reached into the shoebox. Grace lay on her side, eyes closed, body limp. Cold. Margaret's breath stopped. She lifted the puppy, pressed her to her chest, felt for a heartbeat. There, faint, slow, but there. Grace, wake up, baby. Come on. The puppy didn't respond. Her body hung slack in Margaret's hands. Margaret carried her to the kitchen, grabbed the eyedropper, filled it with formula, squeezed a drop onto Grace's lips. The formula ran down the puppy's chin. No swallowing reflex, no response. Margaret tried again. Same result. She set down the eyedropper, picked up the phone, dialed. It rang 4 times before James answered. Mom, come now. She hung up, didn't explain, didn't need to. 35 minutes. That's how long it took James to drive from Bozeman. Margaret counted every one. She sat in the rocking chair. Grace pressed against her chest, wrapped in towels, wrapped in body heat. Watching the puppy's breathing grow shallower. Counting the seconds between each rise and fall of that tiny chest. Hope lay at her feet. The other puppies slept in their box by the fireplace, fat and healthy and oblivious. The kitchen clock ticked. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour. Grace's breathing slowed further. Margaret heard the truck before she saw it. Heard the door slam. Heard boots on the porch. James came through the door with his medical bag. He didn't speak, just crossed to Margaret and took Grace from her hands. He examined the puppy on the kitchen table, checked her gums, her eyes, her pulse. Hypoglycemia. His voice was flat, professional, the voice he used to deliver diagnoses. Her system can't process the formula efficiently. Blood sugars crashed. Can you fix it? James pulled supplies from his bag, tiny IV line, glucose solution, tape. I can try. But Mom—" He paused, looked at her. "Runts don't always make it. You know that. Sometimes they just fade." Margaret took Grace back, held her close. She didn't fight this hard to fade. James stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, let's set up the drip." They worked through the afternoon. James rigged a makeshift IV using the smallest catheter he had. Margaret held Grace while he inserted the needle. So thin, it was almost invisible. Glucose solution dripped. Slowly, one drop at a time. Grace didn't move. The county inspector didn't come. Margaret had forgotten about the appointment entirely. Right now, nothing existed outside this room, this puppy, this fight. Night fell. James lit a fire. The warmth spread through the living room, but Grace's body stayed cold. Margaret held her against bare skin, chest to chest, heartbeat to heartbeat. At midnight, Grace stopped breathing. Margaret felt it happen. The tiny chest went still against hers. The small warmth faded. "James?" He was beside her in an instant, took the puppy, tilted her head back, cleared her mouth, puffed tiny breaths into her lungs. Nothing. He did it again and again. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on." Grace lay limp in his hands. James looked at Margaret. She saw what he was about to say. "Don't!" Her voice was ice. "Don't you dare tell me to let go!" James closed his mouth, kept working. Chest compressions with one finger. Breaths. Compressions. Breaths. Margaret watched, hands clenched in her lap, every muscle rigid. She thought of Harold, the hospital bed, the machines beeping slower and slower, his hand in hers, growing cold. "It's all right, Maggie. I'll be under the oak. I'll wait for you there." She had let go then. She'd had no choice. But this was different. This she could fight. "Give her to me." James hesitated, then placed Grace in Margaret's hands. Margaret pressed the puppy to her chest, rubbed her back, whispered into the tiny ear, "You don't quit on me. You hear? We didn't come this far for you to quit." Nothing. "Grace, open your eyes." Still nothing. Margaret kept rubbing, kept whispering, words that made no sense, words that didn't matter, just sound, just presence, just refusing to stop. James sat down on the floor, back against the wall, eyes closed. He looked exhausted, defeated. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. 2 o'clock, 3, 4. At 4:30, Margaret felt something, a twitch, small as a heartbeat. She looked down. Grace's chest rose, fell, rose again. "James!" He was on his feet, checking pulse, checking pupils. "She's breathing. Heart rate's up." He sounded stunned. The glucose must have finally kicked in. Grace opened her eyes. Tiny slits, barely visible, but open. She looked at Margaret, and she whimpered. Margaret didn't cry. Her body had forgotten how. She just sat there, holding the puppy, feeling the small warmth return, watching the first light of dawn touch the window. James stood up, walked to the front door, stepped outside. Margaret heard him sit down on the porch steps, heard something else, too. A sound she hadn't heard from her son since the day they buried Harold. He was crying. She gave him a moment. Then she carried Grace to the door, pushed it open with her shoulder, and sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke. Hope limped out through the screen door, laid down at their feet. The sun rose over the mountains. Light touched the oak tree where Harold's ashes lay scattered. The granite marker glowed pink and gold. James wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I'm not going back to Bozeman today." Margaret nodded. "Sarah left because I was never home." He stared at the oak tree. "I was never home because I didn't know how to be home. Not after Dad." Margaret watched the sunrise paint the fields gold. "Your daddy wasn't easy to be around. Stubborn as a mule." She paused. "But he was mine." Silence. "I should have come home more." "Yeah, you should have." Margaret shifted Grace to one arm, put the other hand on her son's shoulder. "But you're here now." James nodded, didn't pull away. They sat there together, the three of them four, counting Grace, and watched the day begin. It was Margaret who finally spoke. "That county woman was supposed to come yesterday, wants to inspect the dogs. Someone called in a complaint." James turned to look at her. Who would do that? Margaret thought of Martha Hendricks, of 30 years of friendship, of the silence that had grown between them like a wall. "Doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is what happens next." But even as she said it, she felt something cold settle in her stomach, because she knew what happened when small towns started talking, and this town had already started. The white sedan returned 3 days later, this time with a second vehicle, a county truck with the animal control logo painted on the side. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as two people climbed out, Karen Wells and a younger man in a khaki uniform. They walked toward the house with the measured pace of officials doing their jobs. Hope growled from her spot by the fireplace. "Hush." Margaret smoothed her hair, straightened her blouse, opened the door before they could knock. "Mrs. Thompson." Karen held her clipboard like a shield. "We're here for the inspection. As discussed," Margaret stepped aside. "Let them in." The inspection took 45 minutes. Karen counted the dogs, checked their conditions, asked questions about vaccination records, licensing, veterinary care. The young man took photographs with a small camera. Margaret answered everything, showed them James's records, explained the situation, the pregnant dog that appeared on her doorstep, the emergency surgery, the puppies she was caring for until they could be rehomed. Karen wrote on her clipboard. The young man kept taking pictures. When they finished, Karen turned to Margaret with that same professional smile. "Mrs. Thompson, you have 9 dogs on this property. That exceeds the county limit for residential addresses without a kennel license. Additionally, the mother has no registration, no vaccination history, and no proof of ownership. She was a stray. She came to me. I understand. However, county regulations require she was dying. Her puppies were dying. What was I supposed to do? Check her paperwork first." Karen's smile tightened. "I understand this is difficult, but the county has rules for a reason. Unlicensed animals can carry diseases. They can become a public nuisance. These dogs aren't a nuisance. They're in my house. They don't bother anyone. Has someone filed a complaint? Mrs. Thompson, we're required to investigate." The words hung in the air. Margaret felt them land, one by one, like stones dropped into still water. "Who?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Who filed a complaint about dogs that never leave my property?" Karen consulted her clipboard. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." She didn't need to, Margaret already knew. The grocery store in Whitehall had 12 aisles, a butcher counter, and a community bulletin board near the entrance where people posted yard sale flyers and lost pet notices. Margaret hadn't been inside in 3 weeks. She'd been too busy with the dogs, too tired from sleepless nights, too focused on keeping Grace alive. But she needed supplies, formula for Grace, dog food for Hope and the puppies. Basic groceries she'd run out of days ago. She drove Harold's truck into town, parked in her usual spot near the pharmacy, walked through the automatic doors, and heard her name. Margaret Thompson, can you believe it? Keeping all those dogs out there like some kind of The voice cut off. Two women stood by the produce section, their shopping carts angled together, Bonnie Harker and June Castillo, members of her church, women she'd known for 30 years. They looked at her, then looked away. Margaret grabbed a cart, pushed it toward the pet food aisle. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm, but she heard the whispers following her. Ever since Harold passed, she's gone a little living out there all alone. It's not healthy of us talking to those dogs like they're people. Martha told me. Margaret stopped in the middle of the aisle, closed her eyes, breathed. Martha, of course. Martha, who used to come over for coffee every Tuesday. Martha, who used to call just to chat. Martha, who had stopped calling somewhere in the fog of the first year after Harold died. And Margaret had been too numb to notice. She opened her eyes, finished her shopping, paid at the checkout without making eye contact with anyone. The cashier, a girl young enough to be her granddaughter, looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been curiosity, the kind of look people gave animals at the zoo. Margaret took her bags, walked out to the parking lot. She was loading groceries into the truck when she heard footsteps behind her. Margaret! She turned. Martha Hendricks stood 3 feet away, 65 years old, silver hair pulled back, wearing the same floral cardigan she wore to every church function. Her face held an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or guilt dressed up as concern. "I've been meaning to come by, to check on you." Margaret set the last bag in the truck bed. "Have you—" "I heard about the dogs, about the county inspection." Martha stepped closer. "Margaret, I'm worried about you. We all are. The church ladies, the bridge club." Martha's voice dropped. "People are talking. Margaret, they're saying you've lost touch. Living out there alone, keeping all those animals, not coming to services anymore." Margaret's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I haven't lost anything. Martha, I found something. A dog that needed help. Puppies that needed saving." "Sweetheart, there are shelters for that. Professionals. You don't have to—" "Don't." Margaret's voice cracked. She hated that it cracked. "Don't sweetheart me. And don't pretend you came here out of concern." Martha blinked. "I don't know what you called the county on me. You filed a complaint." Silence. Martha's face went through a series of changes. Surprise, defensiveness, then something harder. "I was trying to help you. Margaret. Someone had to. You've been out there for 3 years, barely talking to anyone, letting that house fall apart. And now you're hoarding animals like some kind of what?" Martha didn't answer. Margaret stepped forward, close enough to smell Martha's lavender perfume, close enough to see the tiny flinch in her eyes. "You want to know what I've been doing for 3 years? Martha, I've been surviving, day by day, hour by hour, trying to remember how to breathe without Harold in the next room." Her voice was shaking now. She couldn't stop it. "And you, all of you, you came to the funeral. You brought casseroles. You said call if you need anything. And then you disappeared. Margaret. 3 years. Martha. 3 years. And not one of you came to check on me. Not one of you called to see if I was still alive." Margaret's throat burned. "But now that I'm finally doing something, finally taking care of something, finally getting out of that chair and living again, now you call the county, now you file complaints." Martha's mouth opened, closed. "I wasn't hoarding," Margaret said. "I was saving. There's a difference." She climbed into the truck, slammed the door. Martha was still standing there when she drove away. Margaret didn't go home. She drove, out past the edge of town, past the fields she and Harold used to drive through on summer evenings, past the creek where James learned to fish, past all the landmarks of a life that no longer felt like hers. She pulled over at a dirt turnout beside an empty pasture, cut the engine, and sat there. The silence pressed in. Not peaceful silence, the other kind, the kind that echoed. She thought about what Martha had said, what the women in the store had whispered, what Karen Wells and her clipboard and her county regulations all added up to. Crazy old widow, lost her mind. Needs help. Is that what she was? Is that what she'd become? She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, saw the dark circles under her eyes, the gray hair she hadn't bothered to brush properly, the collar of Harold's jacket, still stained with something she couldn't identify. She'd worn this jacket every day since Hope arrived, hadn't washed it, hadn't taken it off except to sleep. 3 years. She'd kept Harold's coffee mug in its spot, his boots by the door, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his jacket on her back. She thought she was preserving his memory, but sitting here now, in the cab of his truck, wearing his clothes, talking to his ghost in her head, she saw it differently. She wasn't preserving anything. She was hiding from the empty bed, from the quiet house, from the life she didn't know how to live without him, and everyone could see it except her. Margaret put her head down on the steering wheel. The horn was cold against her forehead. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there, in the silence, and let the truth settle over her like dirt on a grave. The drive home took 20 minutes. The sun was setting when Margaret pulled into the driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. James's truck was parked by the house. He must have come back early. She climbed out of Harold's truck, walked toward the porch. James was sitting on the steps. His face was serious, worried. "Mom, where were you? I've been calling for an hour." Margaret looked at the house, at the window where she could see Hope's face watching her, at the door that led to everything she'd built over the past month. "I went to town?" Her voice sounded far away. "I ran into Martha." James stood. "Mom, we need to talk. The county called. They're coming back tomorrow." Margaret looked at her son. And they might take the dogs. All of them." James's hands clenched at his sides. "They're saying you're not fit, that you can't care for them properly, that maybe you need—" He stopped. "Maybe I need what—" James looked away, looked at the ground, looked anywhere but at her. "James, maybe I need what—" His voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe you need to not be living alone anymore." Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in Harold's rocking chair, Grace in her lap, Hope at her feet. The other puppies slept in their box by the dying fire. The house creaked and settled around her, the way old houses do when the temperature drops. James had gone to bed. He'd tried to talk more about options, about plans, about what to do next. Margaret had listened, nodded, said nothing. Now, in the dark, she let herself think. Maybe you need to not be living alone anymore. That's what they all thought, wasn't it? The county, the church ladies, Martha, maybe even James, though he'd never say it out loud. Crazy old widow, can't take care of herself, needs to be put somewhere. Margaret looked down at Grace. The puppy was sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. 3 weeks ago, the same puppy had been minutes from death. No one had expected her to survive. But she had. Because Margaret had refused to give up. She thought about the past 3 years. The silence, the stillness, the way she'd moved through the house like a ghost, touching Harold's things, sleeping on her side of the bed, waiting for something she couldn't name. She had been waiting to die. Not actively, not deliberately, just waiting. letting the days pass, letting the house decay, letting herself disappear. And then Hope had shown up. Pregnant, dying, asking for help without words. And Margaret had answered, for the first time in 3 years. She had done something, made a choice, fought for something. Was that crazy? Was that something to be ashamed of? No. The word formed in her mind, clear and sharp. No. It wasn't crazy. It was the opposite of crazy. It was the first sane thing she'd done since Harold took his last breath. Margaret stood up, carried Grace to her box with the other puppies. The puppy whimpered, then settled against her siblings. Hope lifted her head. Those amber eyes caught the moonlight from the window. "It's all right, girl," Margaret said. "Everything's going to be all right?" She meant it. Dawn came gray and cold. Margaret was already dressed when James came downstairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her good slacks, her church blouse, her hair was brushed and pinned back. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Making coffee." She poured 2 cups, handed one to him. "Drink up. We've got a drive ahead of us." "A drive? The county people are coming at—" "I know when they're coming." Margaret sipped her coffee. Strong? Black? The way Harold used to make it. "But I'm not waiting for them to come to me. I'm going to them." James stared at her. "Mom, that's not how this works. You can't just— Watch me." She set down her cup, grabbed Harold's truck keys from the hook by the door, then she stopped. The Carhartt jacket hung on its peg, where it had hung for 3 years before Hope arrived. Margaret looked at it, at the worn collar, the oil stains, the faded brown canvas that still smelled faintly of tobacco and engine grease. She left it hanging. She put on her own coat instead. The Jefferson County Animal Control Office sat in a low brick building on the edge of Whitehall. Margaret had driven past it 1,000 times, never had reason to go inside. She had reason now. James tried to talk her out of it the whole drive over, tried to explain that bureaucracy didn't work this way, that she needed lawyers, that she should wait and see what the county actually decided before making any moves. Margaret let him talk. When he finished, she said, "Are you coming in with me or not?" He came. Karen Wells looked up from her desk when Margaret walked through the door. Surprise flickered across her face. Then, professional neutrality. "Mrs. Thompson, our appointment isn't until this afternoon." "I know." Margaret sat down in the chair across from Karen's desk without being invited. "I'm not here for the appointment. I'm here to talk." Karen set down her pen. "I'm not sure what there is to talk about. The regulations are clear. 9 dogs without proper licensing. I'll get licensed." Karen blinked. "Excuse me. Whatever paperwork you need. Temporary fostering license, vaccination records, veterinary certification." Margaret nodded toward James. "My son's a licensed veterinarian in Bozeman. He's been treating the dog since day 1. He can provide whatever documentation you need." Karen opened her mouth, closed it. "The puppies will be rehomed within 3 months," Margaret continued. "I'll keep the mother and one of the pups. The rest will go to families I personally vet. Good homes, responsible owners. Mrs. Thompson, it's not that simple. There are procedures." "Then tell me the procedures." Margaret leaned forward. "I was a nurse for 35 years, Mrs. Wells. I know about procedures. I know about paperwork. I know about jumping through hoops to do the right thing." She paused. "That dog came to my door dying. I saved her. I saved her puppies. I've done nothing wrong except not fill out the right forms first. So give me the forms. I'll fill them out." Karen looked at Margaret, then at James, then back at Margaret. Something shifted in her expression. The professional mask slipped. Just a little. "You really did all that? The surgery, the round-the-clock feeding?" My kitchen table still has the stains to prove it. Silence. Karen pulled open a drawer, took out a stack of papers. Temporary fostering license, vaccination requirements, health certification forms. She slid them across the desk. Have your son sign off on the medical records. Bring everything back by the end of the month. Margaret took the papers. And the inspection. I'll postpone it. Karen hesitated. For now, get those puppies rehomed, Mrs. Thompson, and we won't have a problem. Margaret stood, extended her hand. Karen shook it. 2 weeks later, the last puppy found a home. Scout went to the Hendersons, a young couple in Bozeman expecting their first child. Ranger went to Frank Dawson, a widower with 40 acres and too much silence. Bella and Rosie went to the Miller family, 3 kids who cried with joy when they saw the puppies. Max went to Tom Reeves, a veteran who hadn't smiled in 2 years until Max licked his face. Duke went to Jenny Hayes, a young woman fresh out of college, alone in a new city. Luna went to Pastor Davis from the church where Harold's funeral had been held. Each time a puppy left. Margaret didn't cry. She watched them go, watched the families drive away, watched until the cars disappeared down the county road. Then she went back inside where Hope and Grace were waiting. Martha came on a Tuesday. Margaret saw her car pull into the driveway. She was sitting on the porch with Grace in her lap, Hope at her feet. Martha walked up the path, stopped at the bottom of the steps, twisted her hands together. I shouldn't have called the county. Margaret said nothing. I was scared for you, Margaret. You'd been so quiet, so withdrawn, and then suddenly you had all these dogs, and I thought, Martha's voice cracked, I thought you'd lost yourself, like Harold took a piece of you with him when he went. Margaret stroked Grace's head. The puppy yawned. He did take a piece of me, Margaret said. But that doesn't mean I stopped being whole. Martha wiped her eyes. Can you forgive me? Margaret looked at this woman, her friend of 30 years, the person who had betrayed her and apologized in the same breath. She thought about anger, about holding on, about how much energy it took to stay bitter. She was too old for that, too tired, too busy living. Come inside, Margaret said. I'll make coffee. Martha climbed the steps. Hope watched her pass. Didn't growl. That was something. Margaret thought. That was a start. That night. Margaret sat on the porch watching the stars. Grace slept in her lap. Hope lay beside the rocking chair. The farmhouse stood behind them, solid and warm, full of the sounds of living. James had called earlier. He had news. He said, something important. He was driving down tomorrow to tell her in person. Margaret had asked what it was. He wouldn't say. 6 months changed everything. The farmhouse no longer stood silent. Mornings began with the click of claws on hardwood floors, Hope stretching by the fireplace. Grace no longer small, though still the smallest of her litter racing through the kitchen, sliding on the linoleum, crashing into her mother's legs. Margaret woke each day to noise, to life, to purpose. She stood at the kitchen window now, watching the sunrise paint the Montana mountains gold. Steam rose from her coffee cup, Harold's old mug with the faded elk. Finally, back in daily use. Outside. The fence post stood straight, repaired last month by James during one of his weekend visits. The barn doors hung true on new hinges. The weeds had been cleared from the path to the oak tree. The house was healing. So was she. Hope appeared at her side, pressing a warm nose against Margaret's palm. The dog's coat shone now, thick and healthy. The limp had faded to barely a hesitation. The fear had faded too slowly, over months of patience and quiet consistency. Morning, girl. Hope's tail wagged, once, twice. Grace bounded in from the living room, ears flopping, tongue hanging sideways. She crashed into Margaret's legs, looked up with bright eyes, then took off again toward the back door. Margaret laughed. The sound still surprised her sometimes. How natural it felt now. How easy. She let the dogs out, watched them race across the yard toward the oak tree. Grace chased a butterfly. Hope followed at a slower pace. Ever watchful, the way mothers are. The oak tree stood tall against the brightening sky. Its leaves rustled in the morning breeze. Harold's granite marker caught the light. Glowing, soft pink. Margaret set down her coffee, pulled on her boots, walked out to join them. The grass was still damp with dew. It soaked through her boot seams, chilled her toes. She didn't mind. She reached the oak tree, stood before the granite marker. Harold James Thompson, 1954 to 2021. Beloved husband. Father. Friend. Margaret touched the stone, cool and smooth under her fingers. Morning, Harry. She said it out loud, didn't care who might hear. The dogs were her only witnesses, and they didn't judge. James is coming by today, says he has news. She smiled. Wouldn't tell me what. You know how he gets. Hope wandered over, lay down beside the marker, head on her paws. I'm not waiting anymore. Harry, I know you'd be glad about that. Margaret's voice softened. I'm living, really living. Going to church again. Playing bridge with Martha on Wednesdays. Can you believe that? After everything. She paused, looked at the mountains. The light was changing. Gold deepening to amber. I forgave her. Not for her sake. For mine. She shook her head. You'd say I was getting soft in my old age. Maybe I am. Grace came bounding back, a stick in her mouth. She dropped it at Margaret's feet. Tail wagging furiously. Margaret picked it up, threw it across the yard. Grace took off like a shot. She's something, isn't she? The little one. Margaret watched Grace run. Wasn't supposed to make it through the first night. Now look at her. Hope lifted her head. Those amber eyes found Margaret's face. And this one. Margaret crouched down, put her hand on Hope's head. She saved me. Harry. I thought I was saving her, but she saved me right back. Hope's tail moved, a slow, steady wag. The sound of an engine broke the morning quiet. Margaret looked up, James's and his truck turning onto the gravel drive. She straightened, brushed off her knees, walked toward the house with Hope beside her. James climbed out of the truck. He was smiling, actually smiling. You look like the cat that got the cream, Margaret said. What's going on? James walked toward her, stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I'm moving back. Margaret blinked. What? I'm opening a clinic in Whitehall. A small practice. The town needs a vet. He paused. And I need to be closer to home. Margaret stared at her son, waited for the catch, the condition, the but. It didn't come. I missed too much already. Mom. James's voice was quiet. I don't want to miss any more. Margaret stood there, hand on Hope's head. Morning sun warm on her face. She didn't cry. She was done crying. She just nodded. Once, twice. Well, she said, I suppose you'll be wanting breakfast then. James grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. They walked inside together. Hope and Grace followed, claws clicking on the hardwood. Later that evening, Margaret sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Grace slept in her lap. Hope lay at her feet. From inside the house came the sound of James washing dishes, humming something off-key. Margaret looked at the oak tree, at Harold's marker, pale in the moonlight. "He came home. Harry," she whispered. "Our boy came home." The breeze stirred the oak leaves, a gentle rustling, like an answer. Margaret closed her eyes, breathed deep, smelled grass and wood smoke and dog fur warm from the sun. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Some stories leave a quiet weight behind, not heavy enough to name, but present enough to feel. This one may have touched something familiar, a kitchen that once held more voices, a chair that still holds the shape of someone gone, a morning when getting up felt like the bravest thing a person could do. Many of us have known that silence, the kind that fills a house after loss, the kind that makes us talk to photographs, to empty rooms, to the wind moving through trees planted by hands we'll never hold again. Some of us have wondered if our useful days were behind us, only to find that life still had something to ask of us. Perhaps you recognized Margaret. Perhaps you recognized hope. Perhaps you recognized the stubborn choice to keep living when it would have been easier to stop. It's all right if this story sits with you a while longer. It doesn't need to be understood or wrapped up neatly. Some things are simply meant to be felt, then gently set down when the time is right. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.